Hi everyone, welcome to Module 7. Congratulations, this is the last module of EDU 679, Supervision and Evaluation of Teachers. So I just want to thank you for your hard work, congratulate you and encourage you to make the most of this final week of our course together. During this week, we're going to focus on how we put it all together in terms of all of the data that we've collected, all of our observations, our feedback conversations, and how do we put that together for summative evaluations. And we're going to continue our work around supervision scenarios. It's been interesting to watch and listen and read what you had to say about some of the dilemmas that I put forth for you in Module 6, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you at the end of this coming week my responses to how I handled those situations and some of what I've learned through experience that I hope that you won't have to learn the hard way through experience, that you'll have others that are sharing with you how to handle these scenarios, how to think about them, how to take a step back and really make sure that you're thinking, what's the purpose here? What am I trying to accomplish? What are the risks? What are the challenges? What are the policies involved? What are the laws involved? And how do I support teachers, students, my parents' community, other administrators? So with that in mind, our guiding questions for this week are as follows. What types of data are most useful in determining a teacher's evaluation? How might a school leader differentiate feedback and prioritize conferencing based on teachers' unique needs and the stages of development that they might be in without ignoring the growth of master teachers? And how does a school administrator effectively supervise and manage difficult situations with staff, students, and/or parents? We have 3 objectives for this week. One is to analyze numerous observation write-ups and data sources that are used to evaluate teachers and make recommendations about effective summative teacher evaluation plans and processes, including your plans for prioritizing conferencing and the giving of feedback to improve instructional practices of teachers. The second objective for this week is to demonstrate questioning techniques in pre and/or post conferences that cause teachers to reflect on their own teaching and student learning and that address the needs of certified staff, whether that be teachers, school service, personnel, etc., at different career stages. And the third module objective is to analyze supervision situations to determine appropriate courses of action for school leaders facing each of the dilemmas. So this week, you will wrap up our common read together by Kim Marshall, Rethinking Teacher Supervision and Evaluation, by reading chapters 9 and 10. These are short chapters. Chapter 9 focuses on the role of the superintendent, and it really has more to do with how the superintendent and central office can and/or should be interacting with principals as they help to support teachers and students in their schools. And then chapter 10 is a very brief chapter, a few pages, where Kim Marshall talks about putting it all together. So how do you gather the information that you've gained from many observations and from your feedback conferences into some sort of meaningful summative evaluation? I also encourage you, if you have not yet read the Appendix B, where it looks at several samples of his mini observation write-ups, I encourage you to look at those because it's another way of being able to think about documenting the feedback and the mini observation conversations and experiences. So you're going to be reading, and then you will also, in just a few moments, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a folder that I've put together that has some full lesson observations, because up until this point, we've focused mostly on mini observations for a couple of reasons. One of them is that it encourages the idea of regular ongoing classroom observations and regular ongoing feedback dialogue between teachers and administrators, and teacher to teacher as well. But also because there's a pragmatic portion to that, being able to get you to practice with shorter snippets as opposed to maybe 80-minute blocks or 45-minute blocks, which take quite a bit of extra time to be able to complete. So we want to think about, in this folder that you're going to see that I put together, I put some sample full classroom observations. I've put some summative evaluations. So at the end of the evaluation cycle, how do you then put it all together? And I've included some summary items for goals, for professional goals. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. There's also a letter in there documenting one of the dilemmas or one of the situations. And so for you to kind of have an opportunity to think about maybe what you've learned if you've already taken school law courses or the special ed law for school leaders, some of that legal advice that you might get, and what does that look like when we put it into the frame of supervising and evaluating, especially when it comes to those times when you actually need to document it. Because some of the best advice that we get is that if you don't document it, it never happened. So that's the balance between when do you have just a conversation and when do you need to document the conversation, and then when do you need to formalize that conversation. So that's all part of that supervising and evaluating continuum as we move along. Your assignment for this week is to compose a 2 to 3 page paper about summative evaluation. So kind of your best recommendations around the summative evaluation process, and then how you might think about differentiating, if at all, the kinds of feedback, the evaluation cycle, the processes for different teachers based on their stages of career, so where they are in their career, and or their performances. So a lot to think about there, based on everything that we've been reading and discussing together and viewing together. Where do you stand? So I'm encouraging you to go back and look at your teacher evaluation plans, or look at the plans that have been posted by others in Module 1, and take a look and think about the frequency of observation, the frequency of the evaluation cycle. Some districts and some schools have a 1-year cycle that all of their teachers are formally reviewed and evaluated on a year basis. That's very different from districts who stagger that evaluation cycle. And so you really have a formal evaluation every 3 years where you're working towards that 3-year cycle. And then there are, stages in between. So thinking about your recommendations about the length of the cycle, should that be differentiated or not? What types of data might you include in the summative evaluation? So some districts, and I can think about in my career as an administrator, it was your one formal observation every 3 years was the official documentation of your evaluation. Now, teachers every year had to establish professional goals and turn those into administration, and we would approve those goals. And then at the end of the year, sort of like the tax cycle, by April 15th or just before people went away for April break, they would submit their progress. What was their progress, and the evidence of their progress related to the goals for that year. And then at the end of their 3-year cycle, they would put together the goals that they'd been working on for the last 3 years, their progress, and then evidence. And for some of us, it looked like, a portfolio. It was a hard copy portfolio, almost like a scrapbook in beauty, right? And so you put it together maybe in pouches where you had your goals, your evidence, so it might be certificates of workshops and courses that you'd attended. It might be evidence in CDs or memory, I can't think, but the memory sticks. that you would put in of evidence of maybe lesson plans or websites that you developed or other electronic resources or student artifacts. It might be agendas from book studies that you'd been a part of or that you had led, a whole host of artifacts that would give evidence to the progress that you were making towards your professional goals. So when we think about evidence, it's not just the mini observation evidence that might be there. It might be the formal observation that your district requires. It might be that portfolio or artifact piece around professional goals. It might be a narrative that teachers are expected to write about their progress. In the past number of years, we've seen student learning outcomes, so those goals around student growth. So that might be part of that summative evaluation, that formal evaluation pieces. Some districts use surveys. So student surveys, maybe parent surveys are used to be able to, at least formatively, if not summatively, for teachers to include, to think about what are the perceptions of others about their areas of needed improvement as well as their strengths. So there are a whole host of sets of data that might be included. Sometimes districts also include data about your professional responsibilities. So how engaged are you in your own professional growth and in the school community and in the district community? So that might be evidence of your participation in professional learning communities, leadership teams, if you're part of intramurals or coaching, if you are taking courses, if you're mentoring, if you're coaching other teachers, if you have, a field experience, you're taking undergrad or pre-service teachers under your wing and supporting them, a whole host of ways that we might look at for evidence of your professional responsibilities and the way that you're growing and contributing. So I really want you to think deeply about all of the evidence that might be used to determine a teacher's summative evaluation, their rating. Think about the frequency, like I said, the length of that evaluation cycle. Think about the processes that are involved. Think about, is there just words that are given to colleague evaluation and support of one another? Is it something that's just encouraged? Or are there actually structures in place where colleagues are expected to get into each other's classrooms and be able to give that kind of support? So think about those pieces. Think about, as I mentioned, any differentiation that might be happening if you have sort of moved beyond probationary status, you're in continuing contract, and you have a certain number of years of an effective rating. Does it look different? The evaluation cycle look different for you or not? So really kind of think about that. How much, if at all, are student growth goals or SLOs factored into that evaluation cycle? And then really it's important for you to be thinking about, based on everything that you've been reading and thinking and experiencing, what should it look like? What would be your recommendations if teacher evaluation was to be meaningful, and if it were to meet those purposes that you had talked about in Module 1, your beliefs about what the purposes are for teacher evaluation? What would that look like? Okay, so I'm hoping that over these 7 weeks that you have morphed and adapted and modified and strengthened your original thoughts coming in to the 7 weeks, and that there's been growth and deepening of your thinking. Doesn't mean that it's completely changed, right? But that there has been growth. All right, I want to share my screen with you because I just want to walk you through a little bit of the reading and viewing folder and some of the materials that you might see there. So just bear with me for a moment as I set this up. All right, hopefully at this point you'll see my screen And I'm going to click on the reading and viewing materials for this week. And you'll notice that there is a folder here that's called summative, formal observations, evaluations, and letter samples. So if you click on this, then you're going to see, as I mentioned, a letter. This is a formal, more of a formal letter addressing a situation, a supervision situation. So that's there just for you to be able to review and think about what that looks like. Then there are 3 evaluations here of full lesson observations using different formats. And so here's one, and they're all going to download for you their documents. And so you'll just have to pay attention to that. Here's one that is from a specialized reading or an ELA classroom. So it was a special ed classroom where the goal was to improve fluency and decoding skills. And in this particular district, when we would go in to do formal observations, classroom observations, and they would be full-length observations, we were asked to give sort of a checklist, if you will, feedback checkbox on certain strategies and skills and techniques that were valued. And it really was focused around the Danielson, loosely focused around the Danielson model, and be able to identify those as effective, needs improvement, or not applicable. It wasn't observed, and it might not have been applicable. And then a narrative component to that. So I just want to show you what that would look like. So one of the major components that we would look for in these formal classroom observation was instructional planning and strategies. And when I was principal at this particular middle school, then I would go in for 80-minute, we had double blocks. And so these formal observations represent 80 minutes of classroom observation, which is really quite the antithesis of these mini observations. Now, I conducted, in addition to 80 minutes every year, a minimum of 80 minutes every year for my teachers, I also did mini observations, walkthroughs as often as possible. That would be a minimum of 3 times per week. The goal was for it to be daily. And then learning walks. And that might be with teams of teachers, it might be with other administrators, where we were really focusing on particular items. But this, what you're going to see here, is the frame that we would use for these formal observations. So one of the domains or one of the components was instructional planning strategies. And then you can see the items that across the district, we were all using this same format, that you would see what we would need to then give a rating: effective, needs improvement, or not applicable, or not observed. And then the comments. So this is the narrative that I would then write up about what I witnessed for those instructional strategies and planning. Then it was classroom environment. You can see the same thing. An assessment of student learning. And then a place, there's an empty page, but a place for overall comments that I might want to make. There's also a place for the teacher to be able to write their comments, and then signature formats. All right, so there's several of those different observations, and some of them based on different models depending upon the school that I might have been an administrator in. And then an example of a goal summative. So I was sharing with you that in 2 of the districts that I was an administrator, there were goals that teachers would turn in. And in one district, they would turn in their portfolio or evidence base at the end of each of their cycles as so this represented their 3 years of goals and progress and the evidence compiled with that. And part of the evaluation then is that I would then write a summary assessment of their professional goals and the evidence that they had provided about how it was impacting their classroom and student learning. So this is just an example of that summary of the goals that the teacher had shared. So that was a piece of that summative evidence. Then pulling it all together, I have 2 examples for you here of, and this comes from one of the districts that I worked with or worked in as an administrator, where it was required that we do annual. So each year there was the formal evaluation process. Since then, they moved away from that, realizing that the workload was just incredible. I had 33 teachers, full-time teachers, in addition to all of the ed techs, kitchen personnel, custodians, other staff members, that I was responsible for a formal summative evaluation yearly. And so you can kind of see what this looks like. It was the 4 categories, so instructional planning and strategies, where I would write my summative evaluation. So that was based on at least one 80-minute formal observation with a pre and post conference. It was based on a minimum of 5 mini observations with feedback conferencing and coaching. It was based on as many walkthroughs, daily walkthroughs as possible, and any evidence that might be garnered through that. And that would be the minimum, in addition to the teacher goals, the professional goals that would be submitted, and their goals around improving student learning. So for instructional planning and strategies, you can see how I'm then taking all of that information that I've gathered, and we didn't use a specific learning management tool like iObservation. So Google was my best friend. I would have spreadsheets of each teacher in these categories, and I would collect evidence. I used for a while Google Forms, where I would use Google Forms for each of these mini observations and formal observations. But as you can imagine, this was an incredible amount of work to be able, and high pressure, to be able to evaluate. And we had the final work, the final line for each of these 4 categories was the official rating. And I refused to put in the number score. It's just a personal bias that I have. So I never put a 1, a 2, or 3, or 4. I used the words, same thing, but it just was one of those things that bothered me. But I was required to play along with that. And so it was my little, my little way of moving slightly to the side. So I would give that rating, the assessment of student learning, the last sentence, the classroom environment, and then professional responsibilities piece. And that was for that particular district, and I included a couple of those there for you. There are a couple of those evaluations so that you can see how I might take all of that evidence that I've been collecting and put it all together for this formal record. Now, one of the things that I want you to think about too is this idea about how do we make sure that the rating, that summative grade or rating or evaluation doesn't negatively impact our relationship with the teacher. And so I heard several people write about this and talk about this when you were dealing with some of the dilemmas, is that I think this is the power in making sure that you pass the credibility, the straight face test, where teachers know that you have been in their classrooms day in and day out. They know that you have a lot of information, a lot of data. There's been a lot of conversations. It's a priority for you as an instructional leader. So then when I give evaluation feedback, when it comes to the end of that, whatever that cycle is, there's no surprises. Nobody's shocked. What? You think I need to work on classroom environment, Anita? That's not a shock. We've had so many conversations through mini observations, walkthroughs, a formal classroom observation, that when you see that recommendation and that nudge, in your evaluation, it's not shocking to you. Neither should the number of strengths that are being shared with you, neither should that be shocking, because it's things that we've talked about on an ongoing basis. And the last part, I'll stop sharing my screen here for a moment. The last part that you will be doing for this module is, as I mentioned, continuing to dialogue around the supervisions, these dilemmas that come up, these scenarios that happen. And honestly, these as well as maybe, student disruptive behaviors or situations that they're facing, or families or community situations that are going on, they can really be the fires that take you away from classroom observations and focusing on the instruction and the learning. So it's really important that you have good strategies and good processes for how to manage effectively these supervision scenarios and dilemmas. And one of the things that I'll talk more about at the end of the week when I share with you some of my strategies, but one of the things that I find that I had to really work on is not being, the savior that came in and fixed it all and fixed everybody's relationship issues with one another, and swooped in and here's the resources and here's how you do this and don't worry, I'll fix it. That's my nature. I want to swoop in, I want to organize, I want to fix, I want to just remove barriers for you and have you as a teacher focus on your classroom and in teaching and on students and on learning. But what I found is that that's kind of that Chinese proverb of not teaching the teachers to fish for themselves. So then it became, oh, here are all the problems I have. Anita, you solve them. We need you to solve them. And all of a sudden, my window of time is eaten up by solving other people's issues, which really they could solve themselves. With support, with strategies and skills and structure in place and resources, they could solve them, and it would then leave me the time that I needed to be able to prioritize. How do I help improve student learning? How do I help improve teaching practices in my building in order so that we can continually raise that bar and make sure that we're surrounding all students with the supports that they need to be able to do their best learning. So just think about those things, making sure, what's the balance that you're finding there in being able to remove this from the table or from, the thought of the teacher or the staff member, and being able to equip them to better handle these situations moving forward. Hope you have a wonderful last week of learning. It's been a pleasure to get to know you even better. And I hope that you can see the connections in EDU 679, the supervision between 603, 605, if you've had those courses around analysis of teaching, around assessment practices, curriculum development, 604. Those of you who are taking mentoring and coaching, that course really dovetails really nicely with this, or the 680 course around professional learning really connects. And of course, our Intro to Ed Leadership, 670, and the organizational behavior, they all come into play together, I think, really well around 679 when you start, and of course the law courses, when you start to see all of this interweaving and playing out together, and you start to understand how deep your skill set needs to be as a teacher leader and as a school leader. All right, have a great week of learning, and I'll check back in with you after this week is over.